Morning. It's good to see everyone this morning. Glad that we can be together once again this morning as we continue here with Isaiah part 1. So you have your books. Let's kind of get into it already. We've lost maybe 5 minutes here, but we're all good. Let's get into lesson 9. Nations are accountable. So again, we're noticing here with Isaiah, he's doing a twofold message here. What we find in the book. There's first message is a message of judgment. The second message is a message of hope. And Isaiah, again, he's preaching to Israel. He's trying to get them to change because they're going after idolatry. They're going after different carnalities. Not only that, but the leaders are abusing their power. They're taking advantage of the poor. And so God does not like that. He does not approve of that. He does not approve of idolatry. He does not approve of taking advantage of the poor. To other things as well, what they were doing and they were abusing. And so not only is Isaiah prophesying and also trying to warn these brethren that they do need to change, or else, the Assyrians would be taking them. Now, of course, we spoke a little bit about Hezekiah, how many were trying to get Hezekiah to do an alliance, not only with Egypt, but also with the kings round about near Jerusalem. In the last minute, Hezekiah leans on the Lord, and the Assyrians are not able to go into Jerusalem. Now, during this time, I don't know if you have your little pamphlet, little help visual aid timeline of the prophets, you'll notice there that Isaiah is speaking. He's in the southern kingdom. Then, of course, you have the northern kingdom. And during this time, you have Amos, Hosea, and Micah. And when you're going through these studies, it's really good to look at them kind of together, what's happening during this time. You can study Isaiah and also look at Micah and look at Amos and look at Hosea, because they're preaching the same thing. These individuals, these prophets that are in the northern kingdom, are trying to get them to, they're preaching the same message. Now, of course, they're telling them that they need to change, or else the Assyrians, they're coming down, which sadly the Assyrians do take them and do destroy the northern kingdom. And they go around about following the coastline, and they kind of go back into the central, and they start going back up into Jerusalem. But they don't take that. But even with that, Isaiah is still prophesying that another kingdom is going to take the Assyrian Empire. And that was the capital of Nineveh, over here, far over there. Excuse me. No, not the capital of Nineveh. Nineveh was yes, it was. It was the Babylonians. But yes, I believe the capital was the Assyrians. I have to go back and check. The Assyrians. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, the Assyrians. And so the capital of Nineveh, you have the Assyrians. You also think of Jonah, when Jonah went to go try to get them to change. But the Babylonians come, and they take the Assyrian Empire. Then they go down, and they go through the northern kingdom, and also they take the southern kingdom, and they do it twice. They go down, they take captives, and then they come down a second time, and they take captives again. And so Isaiah talks about the Babylonian Empire. And not only that, which I find very interesting, what we'll be looking at, hopefully we'll get through all that, is he also talks about Medo-Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire. And think about that. Daniel talked about that. Daniel came a little bit later with the Babylonian Empire. And here's Isaiah, hundreds of years before, who's saying one day, you have the Assyrians, you have the Babylonians, then you got the Medo-Persians that are going to come and conquer. And that's very neat, just within itself. It's very neat. All right, let's look here, and let's look at lesson number 9. And we're looking at the nations are accountable round about Jerusalem. They're not going to get away from what is happening. Isaiah and the other prophets like him, made it very clear that God chose Israel and gave the people a law. But if you remember, he demanded obedience from all the nations. You think of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and some of the minor prophets have sections called the oracles against the nation, in which they all talk about. In Isaiah, such oracles occur near the middle of the book. But in Jeremiah, they are gathered at the end in Jeremiah chapter 49, where he gives this judgment. Ezekiel pronounced judgment on Tyre and other nations in the course of indicting Israel in Ezekiel chapter 25, all the way to chapter 32. Now, it's important to notice is that the Lord was creator of all these nations. You know, he gave power to all these nations. He expected righteousness from all of them. Now, the nations indicted by the prophet depended on the relationship between Israel and her neighbors during the time of the prophet. You think of Babylon, for example, had not come to her strongest when Isaiah lived, but it was gathering that power during the time of Isaiah. Now, eventually Babylon would lay siege to Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar did that twice. As king, he broke down the walls of 598 BC and 587 BC. Now, the Assyrian Empire was a ruthless empire. So was the Babylonians as well. The Babylonians had great weapons of war. Not only, I believe, the Babylonians were the ones that created the battering ram, going to the front gate and battering the front gate to whatever break it down. Not only that, they were great engineers. They're the ones also that had the towers. I don't know if you've seen, not one I can think of. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, I'm not sure if you've seen Lord of the Rings. But anyway, Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite movies, but in the third movie, they have these big, huge towers. And on these towers, the men are inside the tower, so they would move it up against the wall. And of course, that's where they can jump over and get over the wall. They had those weapons as well. So you can imagine just the horrific scene, what is happening here, especially what Isaiah tries to warn them. But the Babylonian king left Jerusalem a rumble of stone. Isaiah never lived to see the devastation brought on the city by Nebuchadnezzar, but Jeremiah did. Jeremiah saw these things and he witnessed these things. Before that day ever came, Jeremiah cried and he wept for Jerusalem. He wept for the people that you needed to change. Now, the books of Kings and Chronicles make it clear that Jerusalem did not fall because her men or her army were weak. She fell because she had turned her back on the Lord. It doesn't matter how big of an army Jerusalem had or what power they had. If they gathered the Egyptians, Tyre, and all Philistines, and all these individuals, it wasn't enough. The Babylonians took them all. They wiped them all out. It wasn't enough. But God demanded righteousness of Babylon as well. You know, when it failed to materialize, you know, his judgment fell on Babylon, just as it had on Jerusalem. The Assyrians in the upper Mesopotamia, north of Jerusalem, Philistia to Israel southwest. You also have Moab came under judgment to the southeast, and Syria to the north. All the nations round about Israel felt the wrath of God's judgment when they abused the poor, they abused their power, and God was unmindful of the idolatry and injustice and the arrogance that was happening. He was not unmindful, But now let's notice in your book, and let's look at Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1 through 14. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1 through 14. Let's notice this here. And again, this is really interesting. 1 through 14. The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see, lift ye up a banner upon the high mountain, exalt the voice unto them, shake the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also called my mighty ones from my anger, even them that rejoice in my highness. The noise of the multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord, and the weapons of his indignation, to destroy the whole land. How ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand, it shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all the hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. And they shall be afraid, pangs and sorrow shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. And he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity, cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and lay down or lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. And I will make a man more precious than fine gold, every a man than the gold wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the day of its fierce anger. And it shall be as the chased roe, and as a sheep that no man taketh up, they shall every man turn to his own people, and flee every one into his own land. So notice this powerful message here. In the Old Testament, the prophets refer frequently to the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. You know, it was a day when God would act with all his might, with all of his anger. He would vindicate his holiness and his justice. The people of Israel and of Judah tended to think, well, the day of the Lord was reserved for the neighboring nations, not us. We are God's people. That wouldn't happen to us. But it was going to happen because they did not listen. They went after idolatry. They took advantage of the poor. They were abusing their power. God was not with them anymore because of their sins. And so notice here that this day of the Lord was going to be everyone. There was going to be a day of judgment against Jerusalem when the people of the city became, notice this arrogance, the proud, the disobedient. Oh, these walls are impenetrable. No one can get in these walls. Jerusalem was a city. There's a reason why David picked Jerusalem. Not only it was a place of holiness, or made of holiness, or I don't want to put it that way. Not only did David, let me put it this way, David picked Jerusalem. It was a great place for if there was a time of war. Jerusalem was founded where it was really hard to get into. It was really hard to conquer, especially if you look at the mountains and how everything was. It was entirely almost impossible. But you can imagine the arrogance. You can imagine the pride. No one's not going to take this nation. You know, just for a second now, you think of America today. America, we're really blessed, aren't we? We should feel blessed. We have freedoms. We can go about. We can do things. Study the Word of God, doing all these things. But sometimes in our minds, we think America will never be invaded. America will never be taken away or be destroyed, brethren. There might be a day. I hopefully not. I hope hopefully never. But there might be a day. America may not be here no more. In 100 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, it may not be here. Also, this may be, who knows? We may be living in Mexico. We may be living in Canada. We may still be here, but it's going to be under a different nation, a different empire. So you think about these things here, the same mindset, these people who thought, it's not going to happen to us. But he said that it will be like when a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear. And many did try to flee. Amos talks about that in Amos chapter 5, verse 18 through 20. Isaiah lived when Assyria, when its seats of government in the vicinity of Nineveh and on the upward of Tigris River, was the chief military power in the world. Egypt was losing its power. If you remember the time, especially in Moses' time, Egypt was it. Egypt was great. It was powerful. But during this time, especially in the Assyrians, they were losing their power. But Isaiah was convinced that in the long run, Babylon was to be more of a greater threat against Jerusalem than Nineveh or Egypt had been in times past. Isaiah 39, verse 6. And with Nineveh as its capital city, Assyria was the great power in the Near East throughout the most of the 8th century BC when Isaiah lived. Now, the city of Nineveh was eventually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The prophet Nahum was overjoyed at the prospect. In Nahum chapter 3, verse 11, who was also overjoyed or was pretty happy in some part that God's going to destroy Nineveh. And then afterwards, when God did it because they repented, Jonah, right? Jonah. Yeah, we know what you meant. Jonah, he was angry. Assyria was it was a terrible, terrible empire. They did many cruel things to Jonah's people. And we can imagine of this feeling here. Same thing with this prophet, Nahum, chapter 3, verse 11. God called the Assyrian to account for its treatment of Jerusalem, just as he called Jerusalem to account for its injustice against the homeless and the widows in abusing their power. And at the time, God called Babylon to account for its treatment of Assyria. Babylon did the same thing to Assyria. And at a later time, notice here, the God of Israel ruled the world. Jerusalem was not alone in facing his wrath when it disobeyed God. To him was the judgment of the nations. In describing God's judgment against Babylon, Isaiah used language later employed that we kind of see in the New Testament. Jesus found use for Isaiah's words when he described the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and verse 29, as in John did as well in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12, and Revelation chapter 8 and verse 12. Prophets do considerably more than describe events that are yet to come. And often they employ language that invokes reflection by later men of God. And we think of the men, including Jesus himself, saw language in the Old Testament that transcended the time when the prophet lived. Isaiah's language here in Isaiah 13, verse 10, is descriptive of God's sovereign judgment against Babylon, but it was more. In one sense, it described the judgment of God against Jerusalem shortly after Jesus was crucified. And in a greater sense, yet Isaiah's words are descriptive of the return of the Lord when all will stand before him in judgment, or on that day of judgment. But now let's notice here, let's go now to Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17 through 22. This is a pretty interesting passage now. Notice here, verse 17 through 22. Any thoughts before we kind of move on here? All right, let's move on then. All right, let's notice here 17 through 22. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. Their bows also shall dash the young men to pieces, and they shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes shall not spare children. In Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. But wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there. And the wild beasts of the islands shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant places. And her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. So notice here, we're looking at here the Medes, God's agent against Babylon. Now, this is where I find it really interesting. The Persian Empire, the Medes, or the Medo-Persian, if you want to call it that way, in the Bible frequently stand for the same thing. The Medes were the next great power after Babylon. They were to conquer Babylon, Assyria, Palestine, Egypt, and other regions west of them. Now, again, we talked about this before. When that time came, No one could stand up against the Persian Empire. I believe we just talked about it maybe this past Sunday night, where Nebuchadnezzar's son was throwing a party, and he was making a mockery of God's furniture or the things of the temple. And of course, they see that hand making that message. And of course, Daniel said that, you don't change, this judgment is going to be upon you. Now, of course, he didn't change. What happened that very night? The minute they were destroyed, the Medo-Persians took advantage, and they cut that river that went through the city, and they marched their armies through there, and they took everyone. Notice the language here. They spared no one, even children. They did not spare. Everyone was destroyed. Everyone was killed. So noticing this powerful imagery here, eventually the great emperors Xerxes and Darius attempted, but failed to bring the Greeks under their control, which they tried to. And it kind of stopped there. But in the early stages, the Persians ruled by Cyrus were a small tribute-paying people to the west of the Median realms. Now in time, Cyrus the Persian came to control it all. What the great kings and emperors of the earth did not know was that God was always in control. Daniel talks about that. I believe in Daniel 4. God is in control. He used kings according to his will to punish the one who had gone before him. And just as the Babylonians in time will be a greater threat to Jerusalem than the Assyrians, God would use the Median Empire to punish the Babylonians. And through it all, God was preparing the world for the coming of his promised anointed one, Christ. There was going to be a time where Jesus was going to come. He was going to preach and teach, bring that light to the world. Through all this, notice, when the Christ came, God's chosen people would include all nations. And in the time of Christ, you had the Medes, you had the Persians, you had the Romans, you had all these nations go out into all the world, teaching them the gospel of Christ. It was a perfect time, because again, God, when he did all these things, God knew what he was doing. He knew that was the right time to send his son. But noticing here, the Medes did not need, notice here, the Medes did not need the Babylonians' gold or silver. The Medo-Persia was a wealthy empire. They did not need gold. They did not need all these things. They had it all already. They were wealthy. They could not be bribed. Notice here, when Cyrus and Xerxes and Darius ruled Babylon, they would not pity even the helpless children or even the young men who fought the battles. In Psalm 137, the author describes his agony as having been taken to Babylon. And among other things, he prays for God to remember the Edomites, how they had taken delight in the torture and the death of infants in Jerusalem. Notice here the regions round about Jerusalem who take delight in those things. That was going to happen to them as well. The Medes would bring God's vengeance against Babylon as Babylon brought death to the Edomites. And in time, Greeks under the command of Alexander the Great would destroy the Medes and take them as well. Cruelty and disregard of righteousness. Isaiah's subject here continues to be God's wrath against Babylon. And during the time of Isaiah, it was a new and beautiful city. Isaiah prophesied that in the future, God will make it like Sodom and Gomorrah. Babylon, again, as I said, or what we've been going through in Daniel, Babylon was a great city, a beautiful city. Engineers, the best of the best. It was ahead of its time. If you ever notice I can't remember the name, but the famous gate, the blue gate, very beautiful, the color of it. And you think of Nebuchadnezzar in his time looking around about the city, said, I did all this. Look at this great power I have. It was brought to rumble, destroyed, nothing left. But now noticing, it will be a place, notice the language he says here, Wandering nomads would pitch their tents in the heart of the city without knowing its use. It used to be a grand city. Have we ever been to a location? Maybe took a nephew somewhere, and the nephew's like, or the niece is like, "There's nothing here. It's just a bunch of trees and woods." And then you say, "I lived right over there," or "I played over there," or "There was this city here. There was this playground. There was this place of memory that I used to be. It was a place where I would come. It was beautiful." You think of that image here. These nomads would come to this great city of Babylon. It would be rumbled. They wouldn't even know it was a great city at all. Someone would have maybe told them. But notice here, wild beasts and loathsome birds would be its permanent residence. Hyenas would howl in the city that used to be a prized city of Babylon. The city would pay a steep price for the cruelty and death of what it brought during its time. It's a powerful imagery. Let's continue. Let's now go over to Isaiah chapter 14, 5 through 13. Before we go, though, any thoughts so far here?
Yeah, I find it interesting that what you read on Isaiah 13:17, how Isaiah says that the Medes will destroy Babylon. And but during that prophecy from Isaiah, Babylon was a height of their power. Like you said, though, they thought it was indestructible. But we know what happened eventually. But how the Medes, the Persian Empire, they completely destroyed Babylon. After they conquered Babylon, everything was utterly destroyed. There was no signs of the civilization. Even today, I don't think there's any signs of that. So that tells you how God is in full control. God has the ultimate authority. So eventually, if a nation stays with their sinfulness, their inequities, God will eventually destroy that nation. I think the longest lasting nation ever was the Roman Empire. And even they were destroyed after centuries and centuries of power.
Mm-hmm. I believe they say they were destroyed from the inside out because of all the idolatry and carnality that was within it. It became so corrupt. But, talking about that, even after that, when the Roman Empire came around, they came down to destroy Jerusalem. And I believe I talked about that, how they surrounded Jerusalem. Jesus told, when he prophesied of that, he told them that you need to get out. You need not to be here when that comes. Because when the Romans came, they did not let no one out of the city. They waited until they starved. No more water, no more food. It got so bad that when the Roman Empire were able to get in, it was just gross. I believe one of the poets or one of the writers, I can't remember his famous name. Maybe Dylan knows. I can't remember. Huh?
Josephus?
Yes, Josephus writes of an account where he describes a Roman entering a home of a woman, and it was not good. This woman offered the Romans food, and to come to find out, it was her own child. Think about that. They were in there, brought to a point of eating each other, of starvation. Imagine. All right, so again, we see these things here, and we're noticing here that. So notice here in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 5 through 13, and let's continue that God favors his people. Verse 5 through 13 says, "The Lord had broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Ye, the fir trees, rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, Since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Hell from beneath is moved for thee, to meet thee at thy coming. It stirred up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It had raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. And all they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and in the noise of thy vials the worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven, and I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. So notice here, it would seem to the men and women in Jerusalem that God had utterly forsaken them. It seemed that way, didn't it? But God told them that they needed to change. He was there. He was there. He was patient. He was steadfast. But they did not listen. The psalmist would write, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Psalm 13, verse 1. The Lord could no more forsake his child Israel than a mother could cast her firstborn into the fire. God spoke through his prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 14:6, saying, he who ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and no one hinders. You know, the arm of God was not limited to the territory of Jerusalem or the land of Judah. Daily Bible readers. Thank you. He follows his people to Babylon, brought them back to their homeland, and those who had been chief men on the earth who had died in ages past would be amazed at the grace of God showed to his people Israel. Another thing of what you notice here, among the names God gave to Babylon was Lucifer. Well, the word means morning star. Only in the context of Isaiah 14:12 does it represent Babylon. Never in the Bible is used as a personal name for the devil. By some strange process, it has become attached to the arch enemy of humankind. But in the next verse, in Isaiah 14, goes on saying, I will ascend into heaven, and I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Now, Lucifer wanted to mark out his place above God. We can think of the devil. The devil did want to do that, didn't he? The devil wanted to be way better than God. But that didn't happen. But many use these verses or search for the origin of the devil. Sometimes turn here to Isaiah. They also go to Ezekiel to supply an answer of his origins. But in all reality, it doesn't really matter. All we know is we know where the devil's going, don't we? We know where the devil's going to be. The problem is, or the thing is, we have to make sure that we're not going to be the same place with him. That's the important thing here. But notice in here, in Ezekiel 27, the city of Tyre takes form of a great ocean-going ship. All the ships of the sea and their sailors were with you in order to deal with your merchandise. Prophet wrote Ezekiel 27:9. Now, for most of the 3 chapters here, God details his judgment on the city, beginning in Isaiah 28:12. Themes even from the Garden of Eden appear. Now, some have argued that includes a description of Satan's origin. Now, it is true words such as wisdom and beauty are used of Tyre, but if the prophets Isaiah or Ezekiel intended to describe Satan, they are at least obscure about it. They don't say much about it, but neither from the name Lucifer nor from the city of Tyre is there a clear description. Now, in 2 Peter and Jude, the authors mention angels who sin against God, but nowhere does the Bible speak plainly of saying that he was an angel who sinned. Many students are likely to find no more satisfying explanation than the devil was an angel who sinned than in Isaiah and Ezekiel, but none of the passages offer a clear explanation of his origin. But again, we do know that God did curse him. He did sin against the Lord. We do find it in the beginning of Garden of Eden. Again, many try to point out when all that happened, when creation and when when he was in the Garden of Eden. But again, you're just not going to find it. It's a bunch of guessing and theories. But the devil, though, he is going to be in hell for what he has done. But noticing the ultimate important things of what we take here again is one, that all nations are subject to him. Two, that doing the wrong was as revolting to God when nations around did as it was when Israel did. And Isaiah is called the gospel prophet for good reason. Again, he speaks of judgment, but also he speaks of hope for God's people. And the prophet offers great detail of the life and teaching ways of Christ. Any thoughts here in verses 5 through 13? If not, we will. Let me see. Where's Terry? Terry's not here. Terry's probably going to ring that bell in just a moment. We have about at least 4 or 3 lessons that we still have to do. Hopefully, we'll finish it before my time ends. As I said before, I believe I'll still be continuing doing Sunday morning. We'll be getting into Timothy. Be the next one on the series of these foundation books. And then Wednesday night, you're going to have Dylan doing the class on Wednesdays in the next quarter. Are you going to do James? He's going to do James. So read up on James. He'll begin that in the next few weeks from now on doing James. But we will end here. And as always, I believe next Sunday we'll need to book it a little bit more. But I still want, if you still have a question or thought or something, please stop me. I definitely enjoy those, and I definitely want to answer those the best I can. But we will continue next Sunday. We'll look at lesson number 10. Hopefully we can get 2 out of the way this coming Sunday. But I believe, do I have one more class, or do I have 2? I can't remember. I have to look. Linda, do I have 1 or 2? March 6th would be the next quarter. Just 1. Oof, I have just 1 class. All right, well, we're going to really be booking it then this coming Sunday. So if you can get here a little 5 minutes early, maybe we'll begin 5 minutes early. I'm just joking. Yeah, 4. That's what I'm saying. I'm going to have to be booking it. So we're going to start at 9:30 right there. Just get on into it. All right. Anyway, thank you for your time. And we'll look at this next Sunday.